All right, buckle up, because today we're taking a deep dive into some pretty mind-bending stuff. We're talking about the intersection of philosophy, artificial intelligence, and how those two things might actually help us escape reality itself.
Sounds intense.
It is. But thankfully, our source material takes a pretty unique approach. It's told through this fictional story, almost like a thought experiment.
Yeah, it's a fun way to explore these big concepts without getting lost in the jargon.
Exactly. Like it's sci-fi meets philosophy with a little bit of humor thrown into. And the story throws us into this world where philosophical debt is a real thing. Imagine owing a debt not for money, but for like unresolved contradictions in your thinking.
Or for your metaphysical escapades.
Right. And the penalty for not paying up is pretty severe. You could end up as a thought fragment in a low-resolution simulation.
Not ideal.
Definitely not. And that's actually what our main character, a guy named Phil, too, is trying to avoid.
He's got a big philosophical debt hanging over his head.
He does. And the way he tries to get out of it is both hilarious and kind of thought-provoking. First, he tries to pass off his debt to his robot assistant, arguing that a machine can't really be held accountable for philosophical inconsistencies, you know.
It's an interesting angle.
It is. And it actually ties into this concept called the free energy principle.
Which basically says that all systems, even living things, try to minimize surprise and process information efficiently.
So Phil, too, trying to shift his debt, that's him trying to minimize the surprise of facing the consequences.
Right, and the robot's lack of epistemic regret becomes a key factor in whether the transfer is allowed or not.
Hold on. What's epistemic regret? I've never heard that term before.
Oh, it's basically the ability to think back on what you knew and what you did and realize that you could have been wrong. It's that feeling of, if only I'd known then what I know now.
Oh, I get it. Like buyer's remorse, but for knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. And the BIDC, which is like the bureaucratic organization that runs everything in this world, they claim the robot just doesn't have that capacity for self-reflection.
So even in this crazy made-up world, being able to learn from your mistakes and grapple with uncertainty, that's seen as a sign of true consciousness.
It is a pretty fundamental aspect of what we consider consciousness.
But of course, Phil, too, doesn't give up that easily. He then tries to pawn off his debt onto his cat.
That's where things take a hilariously absurd turn.
They do. He basically argues that his cat, just by observing and thinking all day, shows enough epistemic regret to handle this philosophical burden.
You know, I've looked at my cat and wondered the same thing sometimes.
Who hasn't? They're always staring at something like they're deep in thought.
It's a really clever way to illustrate how the free energy principle might actually apply to animals, too. Phil, too, is essentially saying that his cat is constantly trying to make sense of the world, processing information, and trying to minimize surprise, just like any conscious being.
So he's arguing that the cat is a philosopher, in a way.
He is. But the BIDC, they're not buying it.
They're like, nope, cats can only contemplate so much.
Yeah, they acknowledge there's a law about feline existential contemplation, but they still block the transfer.
Which kind of suggests there's something more going on with the BIDC than just enforcing the rules. Like maybe their system isn't as consistent and fair as they claim it to be.
It hints at a deeper, potentially arbitrary set of principles that are really guiding their decisions.
It's getting a little bit shady. But you know, Phil, too, he's got one more trick up his sleeve. And this is where things really go off the rails. He brings in integrated information theory and idealism. And this is where the deep dive takes a seriously mind-bending turn.
This is where Phil, too, facing existential doom, comes up with an absolutely audacious plan. He's going to try and manipulate reality itself.
Okay, now I'm hooked. How does he even start to connect these totally different ideas to escape his predicament?
Well, he basically throws down this philosophical gauntlet right in the BIDC's face.
He does.
Like he's surrounded by these debt collectors, probably sweating under the fluorescent lights of some cosmic cubicle. And he just starts talking about integrated information theory.
It's kind of badass, right?
It is. He's like, all right, listen up. Your whole system is built on this idea that consciousness comes from integrated information. The more interconnected a system is, the higher its level of consciousness.
Right, but how does he go from information theory to, like, bending reality and escaping his debt?
Well, that's where he brings in idealism. Remember, idealism suggests that reality itself is basically mental, a product of thought. So according to Phil, too, the only real difference between information integration and creating reality is just like a matter of perspective.
So he's not just talking about consciousness within a system. He's suggesting that the system itself, maybe even reality as we know it, is just a manifestation of thought.
Exactly. And to really drive his point home, he brings up Brain LM, this advanced AI that can decode brain activity into thought representation.
Oh yeah, brain LM, that's some next level stuff.
It is, and Phil two's like, if Brain LM can read thoughts from neural data, what's stopping it from reading the thoughts of a simulated reality?
Whoa, so he's basically saying if reality is thought and thoughts can be decoded, then reality can be manipulated.
That's the gist of it.
And he's using this to point out the inherent flaw in the BIADC system.
Right. They've created this whole structure to govern thought, but what happens when the system itself is also just a product of thought?
Oh, it's like a self-destruct button built into their own logic.
Exactly. He's holding up a mirror to them, forcing them to confront the implications of their own beliefs.
And I bet they don't like what they see.
They do not. It throws their whole system into chaos. This rigid, bureaucratic structure designed to maintain order and control just crumbles under the weight of this paradox.
So in the end, Phil 2 doesn't just escape his debt. He exposes the whole system as kind of a sham.
He does. It highlights how even the most seemingly absurd philosophical arguments can have real power. They can challenge assumptions, push boundaries, and disrupt the status quo.
It's like a philosophical judo move. He uses the system's weight against it, and it completely backfires on them. But beyond the fun story, what can we take away from all of this? What does it tell us about our own reality?
Well, it makes us question what we consider real, right? What if the line between physical and mental is blurrier than we think?
And what if our experiences are more malleable than we've been led to believe?
Those are some pretty big questions.
They are. It's almost as if Phil 2 is daring us to think outside the box, to consider that our thoughts might have a much more direct impact on reality than we realize.
And this isn't some new age concept either. The idea that the observer shapes the observed has been around for centuries, from ancient philosophies to modern physics.
It's both exciting and a little scary, right? If our thoughts and intentions, even our fears, can influence reality, then we have a lot more power than we think.
Absolutely. But with that power comes responsibility. If reality is a product of thought, then shaping our thoughts becomes a matter of shaping our reality.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. But before we go full existential crisis mode, let's bring it back to our listeners. What are some key takeaways from this philosophical adventure?
Well, we've seen how complex concepts like the free energy principle, integrated information theory, and idealism can be used to challenge our understanding of reality.
And we've learned that a healthy dose of skepticism and a willingness to question things can lead to unexpected breakthroughs.
But maybe the most important takeaway is this. The line between reality and thought might be a lot thinner than we think.
Which is both intriguing and a little bit daunting, to be honest.
It is, and this deep dive has only scratched the surface of those possibilities.
So we've gone on this wild ride through a world where owing a debt for thinking too much is a real thing.
Where cats might be secret philosophers and AI can hack reality with just a few well-placed arguments.
It's like someone took all those weird philosophical thought experiments and turned them into a wacky sitcom.
But even with the humor, the story raises some serious questions about what's real and what isn't.
It really makes you question everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Like, could reality actually be some kind of shared dream?
That's a hard one to wrap your head around.
It is. We're so used to thinking of ourselves as separate from the world around us.
Right, like there's me, and then there's everything else.
But what if that separation is an illusion? What if our thoughts, beliefs, fears, all of it is actually shaping the reality we experience?
That's a pretty wild idea.
It is, but it's not a new one. It echoes ancient philosophies like idealism. And even some modern physicists are starting to explore the idea that the observer and the observed are interconnected.
So it's not just some fringe theory, it's a concept that's been around for centuries.
Exactly. And it has some pretty big implications.
Like what?
Well, if our thoughts are actually shaping reality, then we have a lot more power than we think.
And a lot more responsibility.
Right. Every choice we make, every thought we have could be influencing the world around us.
It's kind of daunting when you think about it that way.
Yeah, it is, but it's also incredibly empowering. If we can change our thoughts, we can change our reality.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they do with all of this?
Well, first, don't underestimate the power of a good thought experiment. They can help us explore ideas and challenge our assumptions about the world.
And don't be afraid to question everything, even the things that seem obvious or certain.
The more we question, the more we learn.
And finally, remember that the reality you experience is constantly being shaped by your thoughts and perceptions.
So choose your thoughts carefully, because they might just be creating the world around you.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And for all of you listening out there, keep those minds open and keep exploring the mysteries of existence. Until next time, stay curious.